Thanks a lot, Raza, for opening the session and also for inviting me to give some introduction words. And I have the pleasure just today to introduce two keynote speakers and to give a very short response. And the first keynote speaker is Erik KLUITENBERG. The second is afterwards, it's Rosemary. And we start with somebody who had the pleasure to introduce himself as a dinosaur of the festival and making sure to acknowledge that he is here since 1996 and also has a very long history with RIXC already. So he beats me by far because I think my first intervention with RIXC was in the festival in 2010, but he's going much further down. But in 2011, I mean, Erik also has been very central in organizing and curating the festival Techno-Ecologies, a project with RIXC, in which all forms of life have been confronted in a certain way with techno-ecologies and actually abolishing the very notion that technology would be something artificial, but rather to think in the sense of the three ecologies from Guattari and so on, that the ecologies already are, of course, constituted by the environment, by social relations, but also by human subjectivity. So we have to address ecologies in a very, very ecological and psychoanalytical sense at the same time. So as a writer, theorist, curator, and educator, Erik has been working at the intersections of art, culture, and technology for a long while. His professional backgrounds, of course, has led him from digital electronic culture first to the opening up of questionings to the internet, also the growing urgency of degrading ecological conditions, also the crisis of hypermobility. And I think this is something which is very luckily that we can have here because you organized also an event about hypermobility very early, the Electrosmog Festival in 2010, where the challenge was that actually people have not traveled. So we have happy that you are traveling here, that we have you with you today here now. So the purpose of the keynote is, of course, to ask how technology and ecology interrelate. And this leads us to the new project that Erik is currently setting up in the Netherlands. It's called Zoöps, so an organizational model that encompasses all collaborations with Zoe in the very sense of the Greek Zoe as opposed to just bio, the forms of human organization of life, but just to have a kind of social, ecological encompassing and entanglement with all kind of life forms. So this is a project developed together or developed by curator Klaas Kuitenbrouwer. And there's a kind of data fusion art science research project. It's a new institute where also Erik is a lecturer at the Einstein Science Interfaculty. So before going more into detail, I think it's just interesting to see that we have facing this time of a general ecology. Theoreticians such as Erik Hörl have recently phrased it, so that's an increasing kind of ecological understanding of technology, and that encompasses non-human and human species alike. And with no further kind of predictory imagination, I'll hand over to Erik and welcome him warmly to this keynote talk, and welcome to everybody.
It's very nice to be back in Riga after quite some years, actually. And I think enough has been said about that. But at some point, we were discussing some new ideas for projects and a new kind of festival. I will have some slides about that and say a little bit about the concept. I need to keep it at the concept because we're not sure yet if we can do this thing. That will be dependent on funding. And I'm really in the middle of the funding cycle. So working till very late last night on one of the main proposals. So I hope I'm still coherent. But the theme was, of course, very interesting about to question symbiosis from a multiple point of view. And we all know, I guess, the marvelous work of Lynn Margulis and the responses that that has generated in art and design communities as well as in the sciences. And it's very befitting for this context of what RIXC now calls an art science festival. and I teach at this art science interfaculty in The Hague, and we are continuously in debate about what does that term mean, and we sharply disagree within the team about that all the time. So it's not like there's a single ideology, it's about interesting ideas. So I was thinking, what can I best contribute to this discussion? And I thought maybe I should focus a little bit more on some practical questions, as it were, conceptual but still practical. And I called it Designing the Grand Zoöperation. Because I wanted to reference this marvelous project that not I developed, but Klaas Kuitenbrouwer at the New Institute, the Museum for Design, Architecture and Digital Culture in Rotterdam. They did a big project called Neuhaus, and in that frame they had a lot of discussions about how can we develop something that that could be a new organizational model. A new organizational model, not simply for humans to work together within one or the other context, but especially an organizational model for the cooperation, as it reads here, between human and non-human life that safeguards the interests of all Zoe, the Greek for life. And they called this the Zoop, the organization that results from this. And what is really great about it is that they got a legal team involved, and they really started to think through, like, okay, we are coming from the creative disciplines, design, architecture, landscape architecture, art, digital culture, all these kind of fields. How can we intervene into this question of safeguarding interests of all Zoe? One of the main principles is that this model makes the interests of non-human life a part of the organizational decision-making, and that's really an important point here. So I can actually share these slides as a PDF afterwards if that's useful, Raza. So here is the model. And the thing that is really interesting about it is this. The speaker for the living, you probably can't read it for this from that distance. So what a Zoop, if you want to become with your organization a Zoop, what it requires is, first of all, you go through a baseline assessment, you look at all your processes, literally all of them, to see what processes have a bad influence on the ecology that I'm part of, that I'm partaking in with my organization. So you have a zero line after that, and then annually you produce a report to say, well, we've changed these and these practices, and we've improved ecologically on these and these points. And every year that will be, ascertained. And there's an organization, the Zoönomic Institute, that facilitates this process, that shares knowledge between different organizations that become Zoops. But very important is the speaker for the living. So an independent person via the Zoönomic Foundation, also an independent foundation, is appointed in the board of the organization and with decision-making capabilities. So it's one voice in the board, one vote in the board. And this speaker for the living can continuously be the voice for all those who cannot speak in the human tongue. And Bruno Latour in Politics of Nature was already exploring this idea in the early 2000s, where he said, the problem is we need to bring these other life forms into our decision-making processes, but they can't speak in political and policy-making fora because they don't speak in a human voice, right? So you need somebody to be a spokesperson for this. Now, New Institute then put its money where its mouth was and said, well, we will become the first Zoop, and they officially became one, I think about 2 years ago. And they appointed, therefore, also this speaker for the living, went through the whole assessment. It's a huge institution, so it's quite a thing to do that. and they go through the annual cycle. So, oh, then we do it like this. There are now 5 zoos, and I know from the initiator, curator, and researcher Klaus Kuitenbrouwer, who is leading this project and is really the driving force and brain behind this, that there are quite a few more in the waiting line. These are all cultural organizations. But what is interesting is that there are also now non-cultural organizations signing up to become zoos. So this model is really gaining traction. And I think it's one of the most innovative ideas that I've heard for a very long time of how to address how we live together with other living beings. And how do you organize that? It's really on an organizational level. It's design, you could say, but then it's institutional design or organizational design. So it's quite interesting. It's very abstract in that sense, but very concrete on the other hand. Kunstfort Vijfhuizen is an old fortress in the defense line of Amsterdam. Now an art place. The Keuvel is a collective living project where a lot of artists live. They took over a very polluted part of Amsterdam, and they started planting all kinds of trees and bushes that started to clean the soil. And in 10 years that they've been there, the plants have completely cleaned the terrain from all kinds of pollutants. Very interesting. New institute itself. Stichting Bodemzicht is a regenerative farm. It's doing farming, regenerative farming, but they also create artist residencies where artists start to work with farmers together and on the land and with living processes with this regenerative idea in mind. And creative coding is digital culture. It is what it says, creative coding from Utrecht. So. At a meeting where a few of these organizations were initiated, Klaus came up with this scheme. You don't need to see all of these. I'm just putting it up there in the background. Where it says, the common business practices, they are basically degenerative. They just do harm. And we have this long discussion now about sustainable practices, cradle to cradle, circularity, and all that kind of thing, net zero emissions, everything that you constantly hear on the news. But the problem is it's not enough. That's the problem. We need to not stabilize where we are right now. No, we need to really, restore ecosystems. And it's not about pristine nature. It's about ecosystems, ecosystems that we as humans are part of and depend on. And these ecosystems are, let's not forget that, also within us, in our bodies, right? So we are symbionts in that sense. And it's very stupid to sort of say, like, nature is here and we are there. And that idea has been critiqued by a lot of people. But what this is saying is, let's make that next step. Let's go forward. And one way of describing it is going from net negative to net zero is where the discussion is now mostly, but we want to go to net positive. I also heard, for instance, a theater group claiming in the Netherlands, we want to become, as a production house, a climate positive organization. It's basically the same idea, but it's really nice that they sign up to that. It's long-term, it's restorative, regenerative. It assumes interdependence of all these species. It's beyond sustainable development goals and the UN framework. It sees organization as a living system because all these different life forms are part of it. It sees culture as nature, but nature also as culture. There is no separation. And degrowth is promoted here. This last one I leave to Klaus. And we had a long discussion about capitalism and degrowth. And I don't think I fully agree with him there. So how I was introduced to this whole idea was when we did a project. Basically, a researcher contacted us from Madrid, Rodrigo Delso. He said, I have some time. I want to spend research time at the new institute. Let's do something together. he was very strong in the architecture and urban field with data analysis and visualization, but bottom-up machine learning and so on, doing really fantastic projects in Madrid. And Klaas suggested, well, we have this thing here. We have an organic garden that just grows by itself, basically, next to the museum. And the municipality of Rotterdam has said, this is an unsafe zone. There are all kinds of hills and people can get out of view, especially at night. They take drugs there. There's people having sex in that garden and so on. And it's, you know, it's a liability for our public safety in the city. So the garden has to go. And so the garden was completely erased, completely, like 100%, was just a barren desert. And then they invited a landscape or a garden designer, garden artist designer, and an ecologist to work together to create a new garden that would live up to the standards of the municipality for public safety and still be this thing that grows more or less from an inception point by itself, a regenerative garden. And the suggestion was, let's see what happens with all kinds of tools and with all kinds of procedures, what happens in this garden. So we called this project the ZOOP data fusion, and it was from the beginning part of this larger ZOOP efforts, and done in the first half of 2022. And it's an installation and it's an ongoing research project. By now it's finished. It's been there for 8 months. And it went from this totally barren state and then started to investigate by all kinds of means what was happening in this garden, and particularly which forms of life would appear there. And basically, yeah, there's a list of people who were involved. And Klaas and me, we were sort of, you know, supervising this a little bit. And they created a nice video. I want to show the first 3 minutes of this 6 minutes video, but I show 3 minutes, which gives a good impression of what the project was about. Yeah, this is the really important point here. Okay. The important point was that what these instruments that we deployed there registered within an imaginary cube that we projected on this space, 30 meters by 30 meters by 30 meters, which could also go down somewhat into the soil, because the soil is obviously a very important layer to analyze. These instruments could register all kinds of things that with your naked eye you would never see or notice. And the idea was that if you do this over a longer period of time, you might start to see patterns and rhythms that escape you normally. As this garden was growing from a barren state to a very lively, rich garden, which it is now. If you now go there, it's full of all kinds of plants and, life. And it's really interesting what happened there. So 8 months is way too short. And 48 data points, you see just a few of them here, is way too much. We installed a weather station there. There's this night camera observations, electromagnetic scoping, all kinds of other things that were happening there. Air samples were taken and brought to a lab and visualized, and that led to really beautiful visualizations where you see how much life there is in the air in Rotterdam, really in the middle of this big city. How alive the air that we breathe actually is, and you see it. You'll see it in an installation that we then created to make that visible. But it's also very clear that all these different data points, it's way too much. So maybe we would say now 8 to 10 data points, so by a factor 4 to 5 less, would be much more sensible over a longer period of time, and then see what kind of patterns emerge there if you measure on these 8 to 10 points. But that is really interesting. Rodrigo got completely hooked on this night vision camera, and he discovered that the main activity at night was rabbits and couples making out. So that was what was happening in that space. This is collected data that is then visualized. I'm just showing you to give a sense of the aesthetics also of this project, different views. Experimental cartographies were mentioned in the video. So constantly it's the same space and there's different data layers that are being visualized. Here's another one, which takes into account a lot of sampling from the air. And what was very important was that this was a collective project from the start. So the collective decided what to measure, how to measure, where to focus attention, and so on. And that was already quite interesting, but it led to something much more interesting, I would say. So here is the group in action. You see there's a little bit of growth at this point, but very, very little. It's still very barren at this point in the development. And that was a kind of participatory logic that really got me thinking, because one of the ideas that the artist proposed was using your body as a sensor. And one of the rituals that they did was to move extremely slow through this garden. If you walk at a normal pace, you're through the garden in like at most 1-2 minutes. It's not that large, but they would walk through it in 20-30 minutes. And when you do that, you really start to relate very differently to the environment that you are in. And then at some event, they decided to invite the audience to go on these slow walks with them. And to my amazement, people massively lined up for that. So big groups were moving extremely slow through this garden. And I thought this kind of ritualistic aspect is very interesting. And at the same time, we had this idea of, well, you could turn this into a data fusion toolkit and hand it out to other people, which wouldn't just be the sensors and so on, but also all these weird procedures, rituals, myths, impressions from this environment. And then there's this participatory thing, which sort of reminds you of citizen science, and citizen science also does these kind of toolkits. But here, there's this art element that comes in. So we came up with this term that we liked very much, citizen art science. I quite like that term. Yeah, and here about sharing these methodologies. And methodologies coming from the sciences and technology, but also methodologies coming from the arts and making a hybrid fusion. I still think that that is a totally underexploited potential. And a lot of work could be done in this direction, particularly in the research side. Then we could do this project partly, we could buy equipment, sensors, and so on, because we were supposed to make an exhibition, which was at the Triennale in Milano. The new institute was basically invited to make a pavilion designed by Studio Ossidiana from Rotterdam. And we made two installations. One is the data cube. So it's a representation physically of this imaginary cube that we use to measure in the space of the garden. And all kinds of different layers are represented here. So these pollens from the air are here on top with the blobs. We'll have a picture where you see it a bit better. And then there's all kinds of layers, vegetation layers, but also a layer with all kinds of dirt that was left behind, trash by humans that move through this space and leave that behind. Sand, soil, water, fungi, all kinds of different layers. So you could roll these transparent drawers out and you would see all these different layers. The dynamic ones were simply on a tablet. So that was an analytic way of showing this. The other installation you see here, Ossidiana had these kind of peeping holes for things beyond the curtain instead of the walls of the pavilion. You could stick your head through, but then I said, yeah, but I want my son to also be able to see this, and I don't want to hold him up for 10 minutes in front of that hole. So I want a second hole. So we made a second one exactly at the middle. And here you see my son in Milano, just about to stick his head into this data visualization environment. And it's a very super short video to give a sense of that. The idea here was to have a live data stream from the garden that you could stick your head in and experience orally and visually. So it's another way. So one representation is analytic, the other one is experiential. And I think we need both for these kind of situations. Here's the air layer, beautiful visualization. This is scientific visualization. It's not art, but it looks great. A 3D rendering of the space, cartographies, well, stuff that I already mentioned. So, where am I living? Well, this is a beautiful, idyllic picture of the riverscapes of the Netherlands. And yeah, this is typically, the Netherlands even has it in some of its national poetry about these slow flowing broad rivers, not like the Dauga baby, but quite big. That looks very nice. And this green core that is lying in between all the big cities of the ring city, the Randstad in the Netherlands, is traditionally called the Green Heart. It's a big region. It's green, but it's not nature. It's mostly rural. And the cities around are all these famous cities, The Hague, Rotterdam, Utrecht, Amsterdam to the north, Utrecht a bit more to the east, The Hague and Leiden a bit more to the west, and to the south, Rotterdam. A few small cities within that, one of them Gouda, where we more or less live on the edge of that city, an old historical city, very beautiful small city at the river there, a smaller river, and sometimes referred to as the capital of the Green Heart, but there are other small cities in that region who are competing for the same title, Boerenhoven aan de Rijn and a few others. They all want to be the capital of the Green Heart. But in Gouda, everything is branded Green Heart. So you have like Green Heart health insurance and Green Heart this and Green Heart that. This hospital is called the Green Heart Hospital, etc., etc. So yeah, very nice, very green. So we came up with this idea that we're working on now. Let's do a Green Heart Biennale, a kind of arts festival for every 2 years, but one that is specifically focused on the region, but also on notions of ecological art and design and what we call regenerative cultures. And that is really an idea we sort of took from the Zoö project, because Zoö is all about regenerative culture. But we want to focus look at this issue of ecological regenerations really from the creative disciplines, so from the arts and design, architecture, and all these kind of landscape architecture, garden design, all these kind of things are all very important to us. And we decided it needs to be spread out in the region. So if we do this and we got some funding for at least a couple of these projects, we do small projects in the region in different parts where we work very much together with the local population. And this is the lesson we learned from the Zoop Data Fusion project, this participatory aspect, bringing the local population in and together with them, because they know their living environment much better than we who just moved there a couple of years ago from Amsterdam. So we need to work together with these people. And then we do a central exhibition and a program in this historical city of Gouda, just to give people some kind of focus, that you have a point where you can enter this festival. And we have a great location for that. I won't say more about that because it takes too long, but, and then the usual stuff, workshops, seminars, artist presentations, conferences, blah, blah, the whole lot. So the Green Art region, very fascinating and diverse, ecological issues and pressure on a historical cultural landscape. So it's not nature, it's really constructed. It's really intense there, this pressure. And because of all these urban agglomerations around millions and millions of people, they are encroaching on this green core. And it's been there for centuries as a green core, but it's increasingly under pressure. It has been described by some urbanists as the green metropolis, basically a ring of cities and a green core. I still think that idea is really important, but it's very much under threat. And so these cities, yeah, I mentioned them already. So you see it here immediately. This is an aerial photo right next to Gouda. It's under heavy pressure because of urbanization and especially construction of houses, because there's a housing crisis apparently in the Netherlands. Then tensions with recreational and nature functions, but also all kinds of traditional forms of agriculture and horticulture. They are under incredible ecological pressure. And that gives us a great context to talk about and try out in practice regenerative projects. This is a massive new district, thousands of houses that are built there in a former polder, dried lands. And that is exactly the drama that is now taking place in this region, because there's large-scale agriculture in the whole region. It's been there for a very long time. In the past, they dried it with windmills. Now, of course, with very large turbines and so on, massive ones. They are so massive, they can reverse the flow of the rivers there. So if the river needs to flow inland, they can just turn the turbines around and flow it like that. But they are pumping away the water for the big agricultural machines. The problem is the land is subsiding, is going down by 1 centimeter per year. Actually, the land going down, it's going down faster than the sea level is going up. Now, the projections are for towards the end of this century, that we might be looking at 5 meters of increased sea level rise. Currently, this place where the building is 6.5 meters below sea levels, 6.5 meters. It's lower than the bottom of the North Sea. Yeah, just keep that in mind. So the land is lower than the bottom of the sea. Yeah? And it's going down faster than the sea is going up. So with that projection, we are looking at 11 or 12 meters of height difference. That's unsustainable. What that leads to is that the fresh water is pushed more and more inwards, land inwards, and the salt water is intruding in the entire region. Eventually, freshwater agriculture will simply become totally impossible in this region, even though for centuries they've been doing that. And we need to think about what does that mean, particularly what does that mean for people who have lived there for generations and generations and generations and identify with that territory. And if you look at the policy frameworks and research projects, there's one social actor that's totally absent everywhere, and that's the people who actually live in the region. There's massive research projects. They're not talking to the people who live there at all, zero. They're just talking specialists, engineers, researchers, and policymakers. And the inhabitants are excluded from the discussion. So we are now working with these local projects. We came up with 4 themes that link to this. One is swamp imaginaries, which deals all with swamp areas, water, wetlands, moors, swamps, great stuff to work with, because originally most of this area was swamps. And these swamps were at some point dragged out. They made briquettes out of it, turf briquettes, and basically used it as a fuel. They literally burned their own lands. So you have beautiful lakes there where people do water sports and so on. Very idyllic. And they result from just people digging up the land and burning it up in massive CO2 emissions. But if you reverse that process, actually the swamps become massive sinks, so places that hold CO2 and nitrogen, the 2 gases that are very much at the core of discussions about climate change. So they, yeah. The second one is the underground. You see a nice project by Christine Witt, Danish artist, where she sonifies life in the soil. So we look at everything that's happening in the soil. We look at waterworks. We go to this massive rivers, Maas and Waal, where they flow together outside of the historical fortress town of Gorinchem in the southeast of the region. And we will investigate sonically, also with super and subsonic instruments, what is happening in these waterworks, in these massive water infrastructures, with the local population to make their own recordings like that, and to explore their own terrain. And Arboreal is the last one. There's an interesting project with digitizing characteristic trees that are ecologically very important, but also hold a strong symbolical value for people who locally live in communities. So this is something that we're also exploring, the meaning of these trees. And in the small village of Boskoop, right next to us, they've been growing trees for centuries and exporting them. There's 700 plantations in this little village, 700 in one little village. It's totally insane. And they're becoming unsustainable, right? So, you know, thinking this through is really vital, I think. Yeah. And we want to share that, and I call this sharing a regenerative eco-commons, sharing knowledge globally. Yeah, and we set it up as a ZOOP, so if that all happens, we would also become the first festival ZOOP. That would be really cool. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I guess that my humble task will be giving a short response. And since we are talking in a very Dutch context, obviously, I will just hook up a very striking experience. That's why I'm not going to take it too long. When Rem Koolhaas was followed in a talk at Goldsmiths College, and Luciana Parisi gave a keynote, a response to the keynote was longer than the keynote. And actually, Rem Koolhaas very politely saying after the response, that was a very nice response, but I don't know how it relates to my talk. I cannot see any connection. So not trying to do that, but indeed trying to respond a little bit in a way that it makes sense to me. Yes, you have been very much focusing on nature is not green, which is several cultural actors also in the Netherlands.
Green is not nature.
Oh, and nature is not green, maybe. And this is also the topic that we worked together with RIXC some years ago about ungreening greenness. So to treat green as the most anthropocentric color, even if it's a kind of necropolitical color, that in a certain way maybe has to be replaced by what Jeffrey Cohen calls prismatic ecology, an ecology which is not the smooth kind of metaphoric image that we have, but to go beyond color coding, and therefore also by color coding to rematerialize color codings, which is going to metabolize the metaphoric. So to move from metaphors to metabols in a certain way. So when I just spontaneously looked at what you did with the project, of course, it's kind of cube-like extract. It's like a kind of sensitive cynic dog, like a kind of past prototo relationship, where you don't claim actually that you are actually measuring everything, but that you actually point to what you could measure. So, of course, you're connecting the invisibility of the macroscopic to the incomprehensibility of the macroscopic, and therefore circumvent or avoid this kind of human-centric position that we have in our mesoscopic bubble, which is something that in my own curatorial practice I address as microperformativity, which is also the topic of tomorrow's talk. So I was just wondering also what this kind of data fusion, providing a lot of data, actually makes in the context of art. Because every scientist will say it doesn't produce any relevant data, no? So it's to shift actually the perception of what you're measuring from quantitative reductionist scientific data that can be short-circuited in a way that it makes sense, but rather to give an example synecdochically of what could be measured and what should be measured when you want to understand and comprehend the complexity of the issues at stake. So maybe what the art is bringing in here is more this kind of ritualistic kind of co-corporality of actually what you said is the ritual, moving through, have the other their own bodies as senses. And to go beyond, again, this vocabulary of sustainable, and I think the degenerative to regenerative is once very important here, because what do we want to sustain? Do we want to have green ecology and green economy in the sense that we are actually trying to combine business models of green ecology with capitalist and necropolitics and petrofascism? So in which sense do we actually trigger through the arts a movement that is not sustaining what existing, but regenerate in that way? And this is the scalability, was for me, the scalability of the cartography was the most important and interesting part, to give us chance to see all the factors and to flick through all the factors that then in a kind of circular understanding would make sense. Also, I was struck by the introduction that you gave, that you were actually inspired by the holobeyond. And we're actually talking about the holobeyond principle by Lynn Margulis tomorrow, which is actually to give up this kind of artificial distinction between self and other, about human as being separated from so-called nature or ecologies by having this boundary being made porous, and to actually to consider the half of that at the same time that we're messing up our environment, we're also messing up our environment. when it comes to the antibiotics crisis, when it comes to the reduction of oral or gut microbiota, which cause, according to certain scientists, also new forms of autism and other pathologies, that we are actually messing up both. So this is, of course, part of the holobiont theory. That is part of our session tomorrow. So I just want to come back maybe to this notion of design, because you're teaching at a design institute to say, can we actually art and design? So it's an interesting question maybe for you to respond to the response in how far we can design this kind of cooperations and in how far we can actually give them a voice. I mean, the voice is something in terms of biosemiotics, which just is considered as a symbolic way, where you are much more looking at the indexical kind of connections. The indexical sides is that we are having equivalence between also those who cannot speak, but which we can measure. And I looked up a little bit the motivations of the project and found that you're also very much interested in Maori culture and in how far in New Zealand they have considered a mountain, a river, and what else? It was a forest, a river, and a mountain to be granted status of a legal person. And this is coming back to the very notion of a legal person, which we also have in Ecuador, for example, where biodiversity also and nature as a person has been considered as a juridical kind of perspective to be written in the constitution. So maybe this is interesting for us as Westerners and as designers of our own green landscapes in the Netherlands and elsewhere, and how far this voice-giving process is something that is just being an evocation, or in how far this has to be translated into concrete political actions, and how far art can contribute to that. So I don't want to extend it even further, but just really give a bit of flash for thought and for later on when we can maybe have Q&As, but maybe according to the small kind of scope of spontaneous directions, do you want to respond to this point?
No, yeah, great points, but yeah, the problem is, of course, that there is still a kind of vista there, right? When you do all this data measuring, and that sort of imposes a certain view that is still to some extent human, and that's very difficult to get away from, but it's a challenge. And I think you raised quite a few interesting points also between symbolic and indexical. That's really important to look at in these kind of cases. So, you know, I wouldn't by any means say that we cracked the problem. We were just scratching and trying out stuff. But I think that's the most important thing you can do. Try out things and, you know, experimentally find out what might work and what probably doesn't.
I want to introduce the second keynote speaker, Rosemary. And we also have a longer short history. We crossed in Denmark and many spaces and so on. So Rosemary is an artist and media researcher. Her work is considering how actually image production technologies fit within a larger narrative about art, knowledge, and relations between humans and machines. So her practice is inspired, but we usually refer to as media archaeology, which I think is very important to think not only the progress of this kind of a row going further and further and further in kind of modernist principle, but actually to learn from the past and to learn from deep space and deep time, which Zielinski, for example, has called variantology, but others such as Hutamo refer to as media archaeology as a method. So to develop a better understanding of how current methods and ideas about art and technology are influenced by those of the past. So this is also the topic of her recent book coming out of a PhD project, Machine Learning and Notions of the Image, which she has completed while we were still meeting in Copenhagen at the IT University of Copenhagen in 2020. So currently, Rosemary lectures at the University of Porto in the Masters in Multimedia program, and her work has been presented, of course, by many international festivals, context, and also including the residents within the European Media and Art Platform, which also RIXC is strongly committed to. So just, I think that the forthcoming half an hour or so will will fill us really with the idea that we are probably wanting to go beyond the newness factor of generative images and text-to-image generators. I recently was myself invited to Korea to give a kind of critical approach to artists and practices with regards to artificial intelligence, and just started myself by DALL-E. DALL-E, which is a typical text-to-image generator and used recently by the DALL-E Museum in the US to actually give the audience the opportunity to speak dreams into the DALL-E machine that will then produce kind of blurry images as if DALL-E had nightmares. Very often in this kind of text-to-image generating principles, we're forgetting that we also may have to look backwards rather than look forwards, and that all this kind of technological kind of conditionments that we are currently trying to face when we talk about AI goes back to the need of a deeper understanding of how algorithmic images have worked in the past and what we can learn from that. So rather than moving forwards in a kind of prospective kind of frenzy, we would like to hear from Rosemary in how far it's worth to look backwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens, for the wonderful introduction. It was very thorough, so I feel like I'll try to kind of give a little bit more depth about what the work that I've been doing and some of this perspective, this deep time perspective on generative AI. So I guess yeah, before we dive into the topic, I'll just start by kind of introducing myself and giving a little bit of context. So I'm an artist and scholar working between media studies, image studies, and media archaeology. And as Jens mentioned, I've been based in Porto in Portugal for the past 4 years, and I'm working in the Faculty of Engineering in the University of Porto there. So publishing is also a very important aspect of the work that I do, and I've been writing theory, also writing about my own artistic practice and reflecting on that, how it relates to theory, and then also writing about the work of other artists who deal with art and technology. So because the work that I do is quite interdisciplinary, I find that media archaeology is a useful frame of reference for understanding what I do, because it kind of transgresses a lot of boundaries. So it's a field and a discipline that seeks to better understand contemporary media artifacts in connection to the longer histories that shape them. And media archaeology often looks to earlier precursor technologies, to those of today, and even to what might be called dead media, in order to understand how we might gain new insights from looking backward. And so, of course, excavation, unearthing, digging are kind of important metaphors for this kind of work. So, for example, we might look to pre-cinematic devices, such as the stereoscope on the left, in order to look at lineages of film or digital media, which might not be immediately associated with that. And we can use these to draw inspiration from the significance that older kinds of implements have shaped the world that we live in now. And so exactly referring to Siegfried Zielinski's deep time perspective on media, it allows us to learn from the distant past, in contrast to the common tendency that we have to associate technology primarily in terms of the new. So in my artistic practice, I've been connecting these ideas to wider concerns, such as the position of the human relative to technology and non-humans from an ecological perspective. In my work, Symbiotic Sound, for example, I surgically implanted speakers into carnivorous pitcher plants as a way of materially and also sonically intervening in relationships between different kinds of species. And this was inspired by a particular symbiotic relationship between bats and these pitcher plants, where the bats echolocate to find the pitcher plants and then roost there because it's a safe place for them to rest, while the pitcher plants gain nutrition from the bats because they carry parasites and also leave guano behind. So there's this mutually beneficial relationship there. So I produced this work that kind of reflects on that relationship. So another theme that's quite important in my work is the materiality of digital media. And I've approached this through alternative framings of natural history and primarily through the lens of e-waste. So in my project Cloud Harvest, this involved deconstructing a smartphone down to its chemical composition as a way to discuss the materiality of cloud computing. And I displayed this in a kind of interpretation of a cloud chamber to kind of work with that metaphor. So I also look into the infrastructures of visibility that shape the presentation of knowledge through the presentation of cultural and technological artifacts. And I find this really relevant to the way that we structure systems of value that we apply then to material artifacts of culture. So in my project Molten Media, I was kind of thinking about presenting a post-natural history that rewrites some of the narratives in order to include technology in our framings. And it's also a bit of a reminder that technology is part of our past, but also our present and our future. So in several of my projects, I've worked with replicating natural history museum displays. And I use that context in order to present collections of specimens that often blur the boundaries between natural, artificial, human, machine, plant, animal, and mineral. So considering this through the lens of extractivist landscapes for the exhibition Becoming and book Becoming Geological, I produced a work called Absorption, Saturation, Toxicity, Elimination, which was an installation and also a printed component, where I focused specifically on lithium as a point of convergence between the extraction of minerals from the earth and also connecting that with its metabolism in the human body and in electronics. So this year I was an artist in residence with the European Media Art Platform, hosted by NAME in Limassol, Cyprus. And in that context, I produced a work titled A Structural Plan for Imitation, Engines of Differentiation. And that work was a collaboration with Alexia Achilleos. So the project looks at how an underlying logic based on the cultivation of difference is embedded in many aspects of artificial intelligence. And a major part of the project was actually addressing how difficult it is to actually visualize what goes on in AI systems in a way that makes sense to humans. And in that project, I was appropriating images from widely available training data sets to produce a video that I then distorted through specially built apparatuses. And I wanted to look at how the images behind the images actually shape the way that we think about about the visual aspects of AI and how that's ultimately kind of warped within AI systems. So that project draws on the work that I've been doing over the past few years, looking into the significant impacts that artificial intelligence has on visual culture. And so a critical aspect of that work is that while emerging technological developments may entail genuine aspects of novelty, the technologies themselves and the discourses that surround them are often connected in very important ways to those that have come before them. So, for example, recent advancements in machine learning are entangled with much longer threads in the intertwined histories of art and technology. So I discussed that through a deeper historical perspective of algorithmic visual media in my book, Algorithm Image Art, which came out earlier this year. And the book expands on my PhD project, where I looked at the theoretical implications of the adoption of machine learning in contemporary artistic practice. So current visual culture is increasingly influenced by algorithms that govern the creation, analysis, and circulation of images, often in ways that are not visually or conceptually accessible to us in a direct sense. And as powerful machine learning image generation tools become more widely accessible to non-experts, it's relevant to consider how, how this impacts new aesthetics and also creative practices that emerge as a result of that. So by situating recent developments in the use of machine learning to produce images in relation to instances drawn from the history of art and of visual media, the book seeks to develop a better understanding of the historical threads that converge in the use of algorithmic approaches in recent artistic practice. So in this talk, I'll try to summarize some of the major themes and mostly summarize the premise that the book discusses and works from. And then in the workshop on Friday, I'll delve deeper into some of these topics and kind of flesh out these ideas in greater detail. So if anybody would like to sign up for the workshop, you can come speak to us afterwards and enroll. And an important part of that too is also that I'll be talking about how we kind of reflect on some of these ideas through practice in the workshop context. So today I'll focus on central aspects of what I mean by algorithmic image production, which is a kind of core concept of the work. So as Friedrich Kittler points out, we have algorithms and processes on one side and artworks on the other side. And between them, things like the camera obscura, the Turing machine, computers, and more basic things, palettes, painting tools, and musical instruments. He says, things within which knowledge, often thousands of years of knowledge, have accumulated. And so I really interpret his this statement to kind of be equating algorithms as well as these tools and the tools of art to be kind of gathering these histories materially and also methodologically in themselves. So when I talk about algorithms, I quite like the definition put forward by Jamie Bianco in it's the Posthuman Glossary. She says, an algorithm is a set of modular or autonomous instructions in execution for the doing or making of something, which includes necessary elements, constraints, and procedure taken together dynamically. So an analogy that many like to use to describe what an algorithm is to think of it as a recipe. So it outlines what needs to be put in, the proportions of all ingredients, and also the method applied in order to achieve some outcome. So applying the same idea to the production of images, algorithms can be used to structure visual compositions geometrically. And we find examples of this in design contexts as well as in the direct production of images, but also in what Frieder Nacke calls the subphase. And that's behind the image. So in its analysis and display, so for example, in image recognition or categorization and tasks performed by machine learning. But algorithms, as I mentioned previously, increasingly influence the world in ways that are more opaque. And these are often mythologized kind of colloquially as we try to understand what might be going on in the subphase without necessarily having access to it. So while machine learning is a relatively new paradigm of algorithmic image making, it touches on a number of issues that have been explored at length in the history of art and also theories of the image. And one of the core arguments of my work in the past several years is that this is then meaningfully informed by methods and also discourses from even the distant past. So an example that I find very compelling, and it's been very inspiring for both my PhD project and also the current book, is Geographia, an atlas from more than almost 2,000 years ago. Oh, sorry, you wanted to take a photo? I can leave it up for a second longer if you want. So in compiling the atlas, Ptolemy sought to create a representation in pictures of what was then the whole known world. And contrary to what one might expect from an atlas, Geographia is not composed primarily of visual depictions of the Earth and its terrain. So instead, it's composed to a great extent of text, indexes listing locations and associated numbers, and effectively geographic data with diagrams and then also instructions for how to plot these into the actual maps. So in this sense, Geographia exists more as a database than as a visual depiction. And it's a structured collection of written sets of coordinates accompanied with instructions for how to read or draw maps from them, like the recipe that we discussed earlier. So Hutzel and Marie describe this as allowing us to think about the image as a database or as based on data in a novel way. They suggest that this kind of image making renders Geographia not a representation in pictures of the whole known world, but a data set that allowed Renaissance cartographers to draw what came to be known as the world's first accurate world maps. In Geographia, we find then a shift from the map as an ideological representation of the world to a data-based catalog of interrelated measurements. So not only did these maps look different than others produced in the medieval period, at which point the atlas had been translated from Greek to Latin and became more widely accessible in, oh my, but it also made them more accurate tools for interacting with the world through these images. Oh my, I think I'll need to skip through some slides because I know that we're down to 2 minutes. So it's important that this possibility to transcribe the maps in the form of text enabled them to be faithfully reproduced, even centuries after the originals had been lost, which I think is a very poetic thing, that this, the originals have long been destroyed, but we're still able to reproduce interpretations and even iterations from this original data. So I will speed through. Okay, so another example that I'll maybe kind of conclude with is from the 20th century that I quite like, is the final work of Marcel Duchamp called Étant donné. And the artist spent the final years of his life actually preparing this work, and what he donated to the museum in the event of his death was not the work itself, but actually this manual of instructions for the production of the work. So the artist actually never had a hand in the physical construction of the work, and what he gave them was effectively the algorithm for producing it. So maybe I'll just kind of end there to wrap. So yeah, I would argue basically that trying to think about algorithms, images, and art in these terms allows us to acknowledge a much deeper history and a much maybe richer perspective on what is going on currently. And it allows us to try to learn from some of the repetition that we're seeing also in discourse, that there are a lot of ideas that have been recycled many times over art history, and that come up repeatedly. And I think looking into this historical context can help us maybe better navigate the future. So just to close by returning to Friedrich Kittler and his perspective on algorithms, he says, "I believe that nothing in this world, not even the invention of media and computer art, can alter the task of art, which is to reveal the eternal in the finite." Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rosemary. I think the response will be very short too, and maybe give rise to another response to the response, because you actually cut down very harshly. But it's interesting that you reference Friedrich Kittler, and I mean, when he was around at my university in Bochum in '91, nobody really knew what he was doing. This is media studies, It escapes all the disciplines. He is crazy, And then only later, when this Aufschreibesystem translated this book from '86 into discourse networks, it was really, I mean, exactly doing what you have described as this kind of deep time approach to how politics, technology, and art making of that converge, and that we have to read that materiality beyond, and also the materiality that is constructing algorithms, And so I just want to maybe go back to some points which maybe help us to think of this map mating as world making, as Nelson Goodman shapes it, that there is an influence that is quite political in how we treat this algorithmic images today, and in how far the look beyond the surfaces, subfaces, that in reference to Freda Nake, you point to the black box. And this black box, of course, to deconstruct the black box goes against this affirmative and apologetic positions. And many artists, as yourself, have been going beyond this mainstream AI based on increased information processing capacities and mimicking human cognitive abilities to produce images or text. And you are really interested in the mechanics and the materiality and in the history of how the newness factor is actually very old. And I think this can help us a lot looking at these devices and not to be just threatened by this kind of incredible kind of phenomenons that are meteorological in a certain way. But you probably all know about Milton Lim's history of AI winters, where there's a kind of curve like, oh, we have AI summers and it's a hype, and then it goes down, and and then with the computational capacity it raises, and now we have an AI summer and we will have another AI winter again. So it's circular as well. And the hype around this AI that we also see a lot in categories that shift. When we created the hybrid art category at Ars Electronica in 2007, it was recently rebranded artificial intelligence and live arts category, which personally I didn't really find very accurate, because we combine a cultural technique with a current technological tool, while hybrid art was very much broader. But I mean, it's already shaping categories through which we think. So I was just wondering in how far this bias, because when we construct these images and data sets, we are trapped by bias. And last year, Rasa and Reitis have also invited Anna Riddler, which is a good example, of course, in how far the mechanization of data sets produces a kind of illusion of mechanical objectivity through computation, while it's actually an algorithmic combination of data sets which are biased. And while having these tulips being photographed in her work and then describing the images and then make them objective, I mean, it actually pronounces the subjectivity of what we take for objective. And to say that the very threshold at which the interpretation that brings this data bias forward is when we translate something that is supposed, again, to be indexical, something that has a real connection to the thing, so the symbolic category of naming it. And then we reach something that I think through art history, you have really a good scope of examples, and maybe you can hook up on that. What is happening at the moment that you have data, materials, that in the very moment that we name them, goes from this kind of objective mechanical kind of frame to an interpretation that we then take for objective in turn. And then this is, of course, problematic because, yeah, we know that most of these descriptions are then also done by a lot of workers and their studios all over the globe, which speak a kind of neo-pidgin English and trying to name something just by describing and creating a data pool. But then the universal language is English. And that is something I really also would like to address, in how far you throughout history and have found examples in how far this bias to produce something that we take for mechanical objectivity and universalism is actually totally constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, is this good? Yeah, I feel like there's so many points there. We could definitely go on for an hour and a half longer just with that. But luckily, there's lots of ideas to discuss in the workshop. So big plug for that. But I guess many of the points that you brought up, especially, okay, these historical hype cycles, even also connecting to the history of artificial intelligence and its roots in cybernetics, you know, the rebranding of trends, and this return of various ideas. And that's something that I find maybe is exemplified in the history of photography, where if we look at like the early introduction of photography, it was considered like the death of the artist, that, you know, no painters are not going to have a job anymore, because the camera will just make art and painting obsolete. You can immediately hear echoes of things that are being spun in the media of AI is going to make artists obsolete, and but also this idea of the inherent objectivity of the technology because of this presumed distancing from the subjectivity of the author or artist, and the point of view of the viewer or the creator through the tool. So there is this idea of, because it is mediated technologically, it then becomes more inherently truthful because it's less subjective in some way. And all of these are fallacies, like and that is something that's incredibly dangerous in AI contexts, of course. And where, this is where it's extremely relevant to be students of history and to remember we've had these conversations before, and where did they end? Often they don't end in some kind of clear-cut resolution of this is how you make an objective image and this is not. And I think looking at that, like how the adoption of scientific and technical methods by artists has kind of always proven that there's always room for more nuance. So yeah, that I feel like that's a really interesting avenue to go forward with.